welcome to our webinar on post-pandemic hiring. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by our friends and partners at the Randstad Sourceright, who will be speaking on some of the really interesting topics that we've got today. So we're joined, I'm going to say as usual, by Thomas Jajeh, who is the Chief Digital Officer and founder and CEO at Twago. Thomas, thanks for joining us again. You've been a mainstay of our show, so we appreciate the support and looking forward to hearing all that you have to say. We're also very pleased to welcome David Vincent, who is the Managing Director at Randstad Sourceright for EMEA. I had the pleasure of getting to meet David recently, and I'm really looking forward to David's insights. David, a warm welcome to you, and thanks so much for joining today. We really appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Well, it's going to be a fascinating discussion, so hopefully everyone will enjoy it. So we're just going to go through briefly today's agenda, if that's okay. So we're going to look at the reason for some of the labour shortages and the so-called Great Resignation, and I'll come on later to why we're calling it, or why I'm calling it, the so-called Great Resignation. We're also going to look at what Thomas and David are seeing in the marketplace in terms of what their customers at Randstad Sourceright are doing to address some of the labour and employee challenges or shortages, and also what innovations that Randstad Sourceright are bringing to the table. For anyone in talent at the moment or human capital, there's a lot of discussion around RPO. It's probably the three letters that I hear the most. So really looking forward to hearing David and Thomas's views on both RPO and direct sourcing, and whether they're one of a number of solutions to solving the problems of talent scarcity. Going to look at the challenges around global hiring, and also what sectors are experiencing the most demand for jobs. And then we're going to look at something called borderless hiring, which seems to be growing in prominence, certainly during the course of the pandemic. And I suppose we've called this the post-pandemic hiring webinar, but I suppose looking at recent news reports, it would be remiss of me to say that we're probably still in it. But anyway, I think the labour market has certainly seen seismic distortions. I think that's probably not understating it. So we're also going to look at remote and hybrid working, and whether that's now a table stake for employers, and if employers do not offer it, essentially, are they diluting their employer brand? So we've got some housekeeping, guys. You probably noticed that we're recording the session today. If you could keep all your lines muted, and if you could direct all your questions through the chat function, we will endeavour to get to all the questions, and certainly the more interesting ones we'll try and answer first. So our intention is to finish up on the hour. So thank you everyone for joining us. So we're going to look at the labour shortages first, guys. So we've been speaking a lot about this, and Thomas, I know you and I have discussed this, the so-called labour market paradox, and what the World Employment Confederation, the Financial Times of London, and The Economist, they're essentially saying that there's millions still unemployed or on government subsidies, yet most organizations or enterprises that you speak with cannot find the talent they need. So I suppose my question is as follows, guys. What is the reason behind these global and regional labour shortages? So David, I'll address that to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I think that there's a number of things at play here, aren't there? I think that there's no doubt that if you look across, most regions, there's been a huge swing in economic growth from negative to positive over the last 12, 18 months. And with that has come this huge deluge of vacancies. So, we've got, I think the numbers I saw this morning are 1.2 million vacancies across the UK at the moment. You've got Netherlands where the number of vacancies are outstripping the number of people looking for work, likewise across the US. So there's no doubt that this huge kind of tidal wave of vacancies is definitely outstripping the supply at the moment. There's no question about that. And I think that varies a little bit depending on types of skill set you're looking at and area that you're looking at in terms of regions. But I think as a blanket statement, there's no doubt that that's causing huge problems at the moment in the marketplace.
Thomas, what's your take on the labour market paradox and the associated labour shortage?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think we see in certain sectors that that are now enjoying the growth numbers we see. We see tremendous need for certain skill sets, a lot of professional talent skill sets. So I think the labor shortage is also mainly in a couple of sectors, even though it's quite broad at the moment. But when you are referring to millions being unemployed, I think these are not typically the sectors that we see the shortage in. And reskilling and upskilling is programs are not always possible, take time. So I don't necessarily think that the available talent matches the available requisitions very well. Yeah. But it's similar to what David said, I think.
Yeah, and guys, I want to look at what I'm starting to describe as the so-called Great Resignation. And I know we discussed this a little when we were prepping yesterday, but my own personal view on this phrase is that it should come with a rather large health warning, right? And the reason I say that is as follows. One, is it a global phenomenon or a regional or sector-specific phenomenon? And then, if I think about our own industry and where we're at, how many software developers are you hearing about that are resigning, right? And just sitting around waiting for the next job or just sitting on their hands? How many couriers working for Amazon or DPD or whoever the hell it is are resigning en masse? How many delivery or similar skilled drivers or bicyclists, if that's the right phrase, I think it is, are resigning en masse, right? So I suppose my question is, where is this happening, right? And what really provoked this train of thought was a paper I read recently from a lady called Anita Lettink, and essentially she provided a critique of the Great Resignation, and her premise is that it essentially arose from a Microsoft study in March of this year, in which 40% of the respondents said that they had the intention to resign, right? The intention, right? So when I read this paper, guys, it really made me chuckle, and I thought, geez, maybe there's something in that. So it obviously piqued my interest. And as I read more of her paper, Anita's research suggested that there is a Great Resignation, but it's only occurring in the United States of America. If you look at the major markets, such as the other major markets in Europe, such as UK, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, the data suggests that there is no Great Resignation. In fact, the numbers of people that are switching, or the percentage of numbers that are switching, is roughly the same as it was pre-pandemic. Now, I know we're here to talk about post-pandemic, but I think it's incumbent upon us potentially to correct some of the narrative around the Great Resignation. So I suppose my question really, guys, is the Great Resignation real if we exclude USA and accept Anita Lettink's premise? And is there any other factors at play out there that are creating these labour shortages? David?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I think, and if you Google Great Resignation at the moment, you'll get a whole variety of different answers. But I think if I look at the areas that kind of we're working day to day, are we seeing higher attrition rates with our clients? Yeah, we are. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there's a bit of an uptick in terms of the attrition rates, but it's not this tsunami of people walking out of the business. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the pandemic has made people think differently about the way that they do their work. Yeah, there's no doubt that it's made people take stock of what they want to do with their life, and people have made some big life decisions around changing career and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's unusual. I think that when something this kind of large takes place, it clearly these people take stock of what they're doing. But I think if you look at the fact we've probably got a kind of 12 months worth of kind of pent up non-movement in the marketplace, and then you apply that to what we've seen this year, I don't think we're seeing huge amounts of people walking out of the business. I think the much bigger player here is the large uptick of vacancies that we're seeing. So it's much more of a demand, if you like. It's much more demand-led, I think, in my view. That said, we're at that time of year at the moment where Q4 always tends to be a bit quieter because people are thinking about pay rises in the new year, bonuses and so on and so forth. So does that mean we might get a bit of a spike kind of come Q1 next year? Yeah, potentially we will do. But I think, that's how dissimilar that's going to be to the kind of normal kind of cyclical view that we have. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure. But, it's we're kind of, I know we've been saying this for 24 months now, but we're in uncharted territory here, aren't we? So I think it's difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen. But
yeah, I agree, David. I prefer the phrase the new abnormal as opposed to the new normal, right? And I think that aligns. I think that aligns with your uncharted territory point. Thomas, what's your take on the Great Resignation, or as I've potentially unfairly described it, the so-called Great Resignation?
Yeah, I first of all, I would love to throw my numbers together with yours, because I have different numbers, and I'm more with good. What David said, that we see at a higher attrition rate at our clients, but also in the market, particularly here in Western Europe, let's say in all of the higher cost countries. This is also there's statistical evidence that we see higher attrition among a lot of people, and I think the main drivers, and for me, it's less a Great Resignation, part of it is resignation, and we'll get to the reasons in a minute, but I think it's also a little bit a great mobility, because people have, as David said, COVID has done two things. First of all, it has shown people that mental and physical well-being is very important for every one of us, and I think that trend has continued. It was important, and the importance was increasing, but COVID has, I think, accelerated that trend as well. And I think a lot of people are just leaving jobs that they believe they're not good for their mental well-being, which they wouldn't have before. The second thing I think that COVID accelerated is remote work. And because remote work is so much more accepted nowadays, people are, of course, not only targeted from recruiters, but they're also looking at job opportunities that were outside of their, area of comfort 2 years ago. So now all of a sudden, it's less cross-border still, I would say. It's within a country. But let's say you live in London, you wouldn't have applied for a role in Liverpool, maybe, because that's just, too far and too inconvenient. Nowadays, that might work, right? So that the exposure to more available opportunities due to remote work accelerates that trend as well. And the third thing that leads to, I think, really resignation or mobility in a way, is that the labor shortage that we are seeing in some spaces at the moment leads to an enormous salary increase or compensation increase in general on some of the very scarce talent roles. And it's not rare that I see 40, 50, 60% salary differences between people that are working for 10 years in a company and people that are willing to make a step to take a similar role into another company. And if you have such a huge salary difference, then of course, the motivation for a job change is also high. So all these things pay into a lot of people leaving the job. But I think nearly everyone that's affected by the Great Resignation, or that would fall under the statistics, the Great Resignation, is going from one job to another. It's not actually resigning to chill out.
Yeah, I think the evidence definitely suggests that. Whether it's your numbers, Thomas, I was going to say mine. They're not. I'm merely representing Anita's numbers, but I like her numbers though. But we'll link your numbers and Anita's paper in the show notes. But we didn't mention this, guys. But Thomas, your last point led me to think about counter offers. If we're seeing this sort of salary, or to use an old school word, wage inflation, right? My guess is, when people are on the way out with this so-called or Great Resignation, there must be a lot of counter offers that you guys are seeing, particularly you, David, in your business line in Randstad Sourceright, amongst your client community. I suppose, what are you seeing? And then what is the solution, if any, or what advice would you give around counter offers?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's calmed down a little bit as we've gone into Q4. But yeah, I mean, we've seen more counter offers this year than I've ever seen before. It's been crazy, and it's not even counter offers where they're going back with perhaps a 5-10% increase. It's we're seeing 30, 40, 50% increases in terms of the offer that they've currently got, and sometimes that's. You get into this situation where someone's bartering because they've got a number of roles and so on and so forth. So, that's been a huge element of what the TA functions internally and our own teams have been having to deal with this year. I think there's a real split between kind of how that's being dealt with. So I think if you look at kind of the larger corporate organizations, they've typically got fairly regimented pay grading structures and pay banding. So it makes it difficult for them to really stretch beyond those and kind of to counter some of these huge increases that are being seen. Whereas if you look at perhaps some of the smaller, more agile organizations, they're kind of unbounded by hay grades or whatever else it might be, so they can really kind of they can throw money at it to try and attract people in. We're seeing clients more and more offering sign-on bonuses and so on, because that gives them a bit of a way around kind of not actually increasing salaries, but obviously giving them incentive to get people through the door and so on. So we've definitely seen a lot more of that. There's no doubt that I think that will continue for a little while, I think, at the moment, that whole premise. But yeah, it's been something that it's been completely unbounded this year.
Yeah.
What I'm curious to see, and I don't really know an answer to this, but I've asked myself, where will this lead to? So, the market now is super hot and people are willing to pay like crazy salaries, and then even companies are doing counter offers. But in any case, like, let's say the person decides to stay and take the counter offer and stay in the company, then there's a certain salary imbalance between this person and the rest of his team. This happens not with every employee of a company. So let's assume, whatever 10% of the company would run through that process, they would have a significant higher salary than their colleagues. How does this play out long term in terms of fairness? The company will certainly not raise all the salaries by 40, 50, 30%, but you can also not have such a huge imbalance within one team, by people doing the same job. So I'm curious what this will lead to in terms of culture within the company, and if people leave for a higher salary, I'm curious to see what will happen if the market is slowing down a little bit again, and you have a few people in an organization that earn extraordinary good. It is a tricky thing. The market at the moment is overheated, and people are willing to pay very high salaries. I wonder where this leads to.
No, I agree, Thomas. And I think if you think about when people are moving or staying, actually, if you suddenly are getting paid 30-40% more than your peers, it does kind of put a big red light on top of your head, doesn't it, when things start to cool down a little bit. So yeah, I think.
If it's 30-40%, David, you're likely to make more than your manager, right? Like in larger companies. So there is a certain imbalance that's very difficult to handle going forward.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I suppose every action has a reaction. I know that's a trite thing to say, but all these inflationary pressures will build and build and build, and I think that's worrying. And if you're the last person in, and you've got a 40 to 50% delta between someone doing a similar job, then I suppose the crude fact is you're going to be the first to go. That's it. And unfortunately, if things take a turn for the worse, which is obviously a possibility. David, I'm interested, as organizations seek to backfill because of the Great Resignation, or as workers get lured away by huge salary increases in the 40 to 50% range, are the organizations and the enterprises that Randstad Sourceright work with, are they augmenting or backfilling with temporary workers or freelancers or independent contractors, or is the market very much about perm at the moment? What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's very perm driven, certainly. I think we've seen probably 40 to 45% increase in terms of the number of placements that we've made in the last 12 months versus previous year. Obviously, last year was a bit of an anomaly, but it's a big swing. And the contingent population is relatively stable. Yeah, like for like, it's pretty stable. So yeah, it's definitely the definite drive is for permanent hiring, certainly. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about is, there's clearly there's one side when you're going out and actually having to hire people to backfill, but the other side of that is to try and prevent your people from leaving in the first place. So there's definitely this piece around kind of how do you help to retain the talent that you've got. And I saw one of the comments in the chat was about making sure that people feel they've got a purpose, and I think that's absolutely critical at the moment. I think employees feel now that they want to understand what the business is trying to do, not just kind of what it's trying to achieve from a kind of monetary perspective, but what's the purpose of the organization. And I think we've seen lots of organizations, lots of our clients really focus on that at the moment, look at how they can upskill, reskill their current staff and really give them a sense of belonging in the organization.
Yeah, and I think that upskilling, reskilling piece internally is a key one, David. And Thomas, if we can just look at this from your perspective, what tools and technologies and methodologies are out there to help organizations look inward before they look outward to address this particular problem?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's two things that we can look at. I think to address David's point that we're looking at recruiting or losing people, and then at the same time we could also try to avoid losing that much people. I think that we see also in the technology space, where we see that internal mobility programs and RPO programs are basically becoming one program, because you have a requisition and it doesn't matter if you get a new candidate and or an internal candidate. So I believe in 5 years from now, in large and mature organizations, there will not be standalone internal mobility programs anymore. And we see technology providers already moving that path. So we see a lot of the ATSs and training platforms and newer type of technology, talent intelligence platforms, blending into these total talent platforms like 8fold.ai, Hitch, HiredScore, Gloat, more from a internal mobility perspective, blending into that area. But what they are basically trying to do is aggregate the internal availability talent, the talent that comes through the ATS, maybe the talent that sits in the CRM, and match requisitions or open jobs against all of these at one single time. So yeah, totally, that is happening. And then what's happening on the AI side in terms of you ask for internal mobility or upskilling, upskilling technology, and these two things belong closely together, because if you want to run a proper internal mobility program, it's a bit different than if you're recruiting on the market, because if you're recruiting on the market, you might look for the skill that you actually need for the requisition, somebody that brings the skill into your company. If you want to give an internal employee an opportunity to join that role, usually internal movements are not flat, right? They want to develop their career. They want to have, develop something. So you need to understand much better career trajectory of a certain role and what a potential next step could be. So platforms like 8fold, are, I think, specialized on understanding the career trajectory of your permanent employees and suggesting certain training and skilling methodologies to bring them into the next level. So technology is certainly already facilitating all of those use cases.
Yeah, and my guess would be that the pandemic has been a force multiplier for the adoption of those sort of technologies. And certainly, if one looks at the level of investment in HR technology and associated platforms, it's I think last year or this year was the best since records began in that respect. So, David, if we may, I'd just like to come back to you, and I mentioned this at the outset. Anecdotally, all I'm hearing about from our customers and partners is RPO, RPO, RPO. So my question is, are you hearing the same thing, number one? But number two, Is it a sustainable solution to bridge this talent scarcity? That's question one. And question two, and does RPO really only work for repeatable volume-based roles, or are you seeing a wider application of recruitment outsourcing across multiple role types and locations? So 3 questions. I apologize, David, but you get the gist.
So is RPO the solution? Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, absolutely.
I think some of our audience would agree as well, David. So that's good to see.
But look, I think it's interesting this year because we've seen a number of different dynamics in the marketplace. I think there's lots of clients at the moment who have got an internal talent acquisition team at the moment, and they've been inundated with the volumes like everyone else has, and they've not been able to scale up quickly enough to be able to deal with that increase. So we've been called upon, I think probably as lots of other providers, to provide resourcing on a project RPO basis, if you like, to kind of help through that short-term influx of roles. And we've done that across a number of our current clients today, but also clients that we've just started working with recently just to provide that service. And I think if I look at the level by which we've expanded it as an organization, I think we've probably added on 25% across our headcount globally. That's a pretty significant number, and I think that's indicative of our ability to be able to flex quite quickly. So I think that's one point. I think the second point is we're sourcing. We've got specialist teams in UK and elsewhere, and all they're doing all day long is going out and sourcing candidates. And that's not just volume hiring. Yeah, we do volume hiring, but a lot of this is much more specialist hiring that we're doing as well. And I think what we've seen this year is, certainly at the kind of more professional level, is that there's been a real push for us to do more kind of pseudo headhunting, if you like, where we're going in and we're doing team lifts and that kind of stuff. And I think that's indicative of the reliance that the clients are placing on us at the moment. And I think it's one of those things, isn't it, where there's been an absolute necessity for it. So we've stepped in and managed to kind of to fill some of that gap. And I think it's interesting. We were talking to a client the other day, and they're very well-known name. They had an internal sourcing team. They did a lot of direct sourcing themselves, and they felt that they'd completely been through the entire marketplace, and there was nobody else for them to hire. And they were hiring tech roles, as a lot of people are at the moment. And we put a team together, and we managed to fill 400 odd vacancies for them in the space of kind of 3 months or so. So I think, yes, there's definitely been more of a reliance on the types of services we're offering. That kind of reliance has changed a little bit in terms of the way that we've structured those services. But I think it's what we're doing on a daily basis. It's going to be more difficult. It's going to continue to be like that. So you're going to need specialist skills to be able to go and source the best candidates in the market. There's no question about that in my mind. But, and I think we've worked closely with Thomas's team as well to look at that process that the candidates go through when they're applying for roles. You've got to think, if someone's going through a job application process at the moment, they're probably doing that with 7 or 8 different organisations at the same time today. So it's important to them, the experience that they have, and they expect to have a consumer grade experience as they go through that process now, and they expect to have a tailored application process. They expect to have a kind of one-on-one engagement with someone who knows about the sector that they're working in, and so on and so forth. And, I think we've worked pretty closely, as I say, to kind of bind that technology with the human element to be able to provide that experience for candidates as they go through the process.
Thanks, David. I think that gives a really interesting insight into RPO and why it's so much in demand and why it's a scalable solution for customers that are experiencing this particular problem. Thomas, I've got a similar question for you, except it relates to direct sourcing. I think, and I include myself in this, many in our sector, particularly on what I would describe as the sales or the solution side, have spent a number of years talking about direct sourcing as the, to use my granny's phrase, the best thing since sliced bread. I'm not sure all of our audience will get that reference, but essentially it's saying it's the best thing ever, right? But my suspicion is, and I think it's backed up by some research, is that direct sourcing is still quite low on the adoption curve. So that's the context, Thomas. My question is, do you think now is the time for direct sourcing and talent communities, or do you think it's got some way to go before it becomes further adopted?
Well, I certainly think now it's the time, and I think we have seen in Randstad Sourceright, at least, we have seen in basically all MSP tenders that we have participated an element of direct sourcing, which wasn't the case a couple of years ago. So I think the adoption is dramatically increasing also in countries that weren't adopting direct sourcing in the past, like, for example, the US. I think in times of talent scarcity, companies becoming more and more aware of that they can in contingent, they can't just ignore their employer brand to attract and retain contingent talent in the attraction and retention of contingent talent. So while in perm, companies have been investing already for decades into their employer brand and going to universities and want to be seen as a good employer, if I'm very blunt, contingent talent often gets procured like toilet paper, right? You get a requisition into a system, you get the cheapest offers from your preferred suppliers, and you order one, right? That's now a little bit exaggerated, but and I think companies do recognize that it's very difficult to get contingent talent, that the talent is basically the one in the driver's seat at the moment. And the talent has a certain expectation on their role in terms of, we talked already about purpose, we talked about well-being, we talked about the experience that's, the consumer-like experience that's expected. And therefore, I think, direct sourcing programs are getting more and more, or enjoying more and more adoption. I think what's also not to underestimate is that the setup that you need to run a proper direct sourcing program, to create this employer, this employer brand, this good experience that you want to do with technology all integrated, one seamless communication. This is a massive investment that wouldn't make sense probably for one company alone. So therefore, external vendors and partnerships with staffing companies or outsourcing companies are rising, and companies like Randstad Sourceright are doing like those programs together with technology vendors or with proprietary technology deployed to multiple. So it's also a scale game, I believe. So I totally see that it's growing, and I think it will grow even more in the future. And the adoption is slow. You asked also why the adoption is slow. I think if people have never run through direct sourcing programs, I think one of the fears is that, how do I do direct sourcing without jeopardizing the relationship with my existing important suppliers that I want to keep, on board? Because the suppliers will always play a role, right? Direct sourcing is not the holy grail of sourcing, and we're not talking master vendor here. It is a selected group of requisitions. It doesn't work for all roles. And you still need your supply base. So it's a balance to introduce direct sourcing into a well-established supply chain, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you both, guys, and I think there's a really great report that Connor Lavelle is going to link in the chat from Ardent Partners on direct sourcing, as they're calling it, direct sourcing 2.0. It's very imaginatively titled, but the actual substance of the paper and the article is really encouraging for practitioners and enterprises in this space. According to the Ardent Partners research, 41% of companies sampled intend to purchase a direct sourcing solution in 2022. So I think that gives us some comfort that it's going to go places, which is really encouraging. So guys, I want to look at I think we've touched on the innovation piece. I think we've looked at the sectors that are experiencing some of the demand spikes for employees, or to use that dreaded term, labour. I can't quite move away from that, but anyway, that's remiss of me. But guys, in your experience recently, or at least over the last 24 months, is there a demand from your large enterprise clients for what's been described as borderless hiring? And what I mean by that is essentially that you can hire anyone anywhere compliantly, that they have the skills. I'm going back to my own recruitment days. They have the skills to pay the bills, right? And often there's two advantages to this borderless hiring. One is it opens up talent that you can't get in your home market, right? So it breaks one of those big constraints, which is geography and borders, right? And two, it opens up talent and labor arbitrage opportunities. And for the uninitiated, essentially that's cost saving, right? So if you look at a software developer in New York compared to a software developer in Gdansk, there's going to be a considerable labor saving there for the same talent, or the same talent, if not better. So I suppose my question really is, are you seeing an uptick in demand for borderless hiring, or hire anyone anywhere? That's question number one, David and Thomas. And question number two is, have the enterprises and MSPs, have they really grasped this, and can they manage this properly?
Shall I jump in first, Thomas? And you go. There you go.
No, you can go. I don't mind.
So I think it's being talked about a lot more, Connor, than it used to be. Certainly, I've not yet seen anybody really embrace borderless talent hiring. Now, I think we're definitely seeing. You look at it on a domestic basis. Yeah, clearly, people are much more relaxed about where their people are sitting to get work done. Yeah, so where organisations would only look to hire people who are commutable to London. That's largely disappeared. Not everywhere, but that's largely disappeared. Are we seeing people being brave enough to say, I'm gonna stick my cloud computing team out in Brazil, or hire people in Brazil to do that? Not quite so much at the moment, I would say. But Thomas, I don't know if you've got a view on that as well.
Yeah, I think a similar view. I think it's been talked in a lot of the leadership discussions that I'm having with clients. I think it is a real topic. I think, Connor, no offense, but payrolling and brokerage companies do not totally live up to their role that they can have in helping to educate and change the market, because the huge problem is always compliance. And apparently the problem is pretty much solved, the compliance problem, if you do it right? But you have to get the setup right, you have to get the right stakeholders on board, you have to make them understand the risk they're still taking, because there's always, it's impossible to avoid the risk completely. It's just you can mitigate the risk to an extent that you're willing to accept it then. And I think that's why most of the remote work trend that's now widely accepted is a local remote work trend. So it's still country by country. So in the US, I think companies feel more confident if they're based in LA to hire someone in Texas or New York than they were last year. But to hire someone in Brazil or in Hyderabad, India, we talk a lot about it, but I don't see it happening really on a large scale. But I think I think this is a matter of education and a matter of understanding and mitigating the risks. Companies like CXC will certainly play a relevant role on helping to educate the market and help then also to show that these programs can run successfully globally. And once we have more, in the enterprise market, it's often like once you have a couple of large enterprises adopting these things and leveraging the synergies or the advantages from that model, then others will follow. So we're still waiting for the first real big leader that starts an initiative in that field. Yeah, and we are, for example, as Randstad, also investing into a project at the moment, or we're looking into a project to train to train cloud engineers in a country where you wouldn't expect them to sit. And we hope that we can then place them with our customers. So I believe it will come.
I totally agree. It'll definitely come, won't it? Because I think I think if you think about what's happened, there's been a real shift in terms of power, if you like, from the employer to the employee. And I think employees historically, where they might have relocated for roles, they're not going to do that anymore. So that's going to put an increased pressure on employees to be a bit more flexible about where they engage with those individuals. So it'll definitely happen. It's just a case of being able to jump through all the right hoops, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I don't think it's happened at scale. There's two companies that I can reference for the benefit of our audience. One is GitLab, that have this GITLAB, that have this successful remote work anywhere policy. And they've got about 3,000 odd people running through that. And then I understand that Capgemini about 18 months ago decided to locate all their developers that were non-client facing in Poland, which was really interesting. And this borderless hiring trend, it reminds me a bit of the trend in the 1980s and 1980s, based off business process reengineering to outsource to lower cost locations at scale. You would have seen a number of US companies, of course, outsourced to Mexico and India. And of course, that trend followed to the UK and UK to India, UK to Brazil, US to Brazil, etc. So I think it probably now is the time, if not soon, for this to really go gangbusters. So guys, thanks for your analysis on that. I really want to dig into this hybrid stroke remote working piece, guys, if it's okay. So my thoughts are really that I was really thinking about this. I walked through Dublin recently, and of course, Dublin has most of the world's leading technology companies there, and they're headquartered there. And there is some substance actually there, believe it or not. Some people are probably laughing, thinking, well, they're just there for the tax. But there's some really huge modern offices there that were filled to the brim with people, right? And I was walking past, and it looked so eerie, right? Looking into these huge buildings. And of course, those companies really built their whole employee experience around what I would describe as entertainment. I remember going into one large tech company and they had a bloody woodwork room. For the life of me, I still don't understand why, right? They had bars, they had pool tables, ping pong tables, bean bags going out of fashion. They had a nice bar on the roof, right? And really the employee experience was based around entertainment pre-pandemic, right? So making sure that the worker was comfortable, and essentially they never left their offices. When they weren't being entertained, they were working like dogs, right? I'm simplifying things here, right? But I think what the post-pandemic or the pandemic has shown me now that employees are really interested in what I would describe as agency, not entertainment, right? And when I say agency, my own view is that workers want control over where they work and how they work, and they don't want to necessarily go into an office every single day. I look at our own workforce in CXC in EMEA, it's largely quite young. I think the average age is about 28, and just doing a pop quiz with them, no one wants to go back into the office. Not that we did insist upon that anyway, pre-pandemic, it was very hybrid, remote first. But I suppose my question really is, would you agree with that agency versus entertainment analysis or argument? And I suppose that's question number one, David and Thomas. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I think we as employers have been obsessed with the fact that we think everybody wants to work remotely, and that's kind of their number one driver. I completely agree with you, Connor. I think what they really want is they want the flexibility and the autonomy to be able to make a decision about when and where they work, basically. So, and they've had that because they've been working at home. They've been sat at their kitchen table, and they've largely been doing that without direct supervision and control. They've been pretty much left to their own devices to get what they needed done. And I think for us to now expect them to suddenly all want to come back into the office is probably unrealistic. I think there's definitely individuals that do want to go back into the office, and there's people that clearly get something from that. I think we started an early careers program at Randstad Sourceright this year, and we brought on a cohort of 20 odd individuals, and it's certainly we're keen to get into the office to kind of see what it was like, I think, as much as anything, and just to kind of spend some time with their colleagues and their cohort, if you like. And equally, I've been going into the office quite a bit, and it's amazing actually how invigorated you feel just by being around people again, actually. So no, I think I'd agree with you. I think like I said before, I think that kind of balance of power has kind of shifted, and it's definitely balanced out a bit between employer and employee. And I think we need to be cognizant of that and make sure that we do allow flexibility, and we do allow people to kind of manage their own days more than we've done in the past.
Yeah, I agree, David. But I would want us to be a little bit more differentiated, and I think Connor made a very fair point by saying, a lot of I think the average age you said in TXT is 28. So I think there's also an element of generation in that question. And while David, I totally agree. I can't wait to go back to the office to be around colleagues, to just hang around the coffee corner, to have the 5-minute informal talk, laugh, make a joke, build relationships, build trust. Because that's the way I grew up. You build trust by personal interactions with your colleagues. But I think there is a generation out there, and I hate to reference them again as the millennial generation, that where not everybody feels that way. People don't make phone calls. Like if I look at teenagers, they don't make phone calls. Like they do WhatsApp, because they haven't learned, and it's not their fault, but they haven't interacted socially with their peers in the same way we have interacted with our peers 30 years ago. So they have a much less intense bound to the job, to the colleagues, I think they're more likely to change jobs also if a better job comes along. And their emotional commitment to build a relationship, to invest into personally meeting people, is not the same that us three would want to invest into that. So I can imagine there's a generation of 25-year-old people out there that do not want to go to the office, and for them it's not about flexibility to choose the day, they just don't want to go to the office because it feels inconvenient for them. The question is, we're not their parents. We can't change what happened. Like if they're at this stage in their life that they don't want to go to an office and they still want to contribute, as a worker to our company, the question is, how can we help them to be part of something meaningful without having established this relationship of trust? Because trust is not something, I cannot call up Connor and say, Connor, please trust me, right? This is not something that's happening in an event. It is created over a longer period of where you collaborate, where you have small talks, where you do these things. So how do we avoid that these people leave our job with the next possible opportunity because they think, this job might be more interesting, it's paid a little bit better, and then they go because their emotional connection to the current job is not high enough. So that's interesting. That's an interesting perspective, and I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, Thomas, I like your angle where you're coming from in this, and I suppose where I'm coming back to is a couple of things. The first thing is, if organizations do not offer hybrid working or any form of remote working, are they going to attract the talent they need? What's your thoughts, David? Thomas, that's categorical.
I mean, I think I completely, we've seen that already, where we've got clients, and it's not even that they're not offering remote working, but it's where they perhaps being a bit where they're stipulating what the work pattern is going to look like. Yeah, we've definitely seen that having a negative impact in terms of, one, their current employees, but two, the individuals that we're trying to attract to the business. I think it's if you don't offer flexibility and autonomy, it's a much harder sell to get people through the door these days. No question about that, and that's here to stay. I think absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing that was just occurring to me, and I think about this a lot though, the trend for fully remote, of course, wasn't a trend. In many cases, the governments in particular countries mandated working from home. Unless you were a nurse, doctor, pharmacist, or an essential retail worker, you pretty much were either furloughed, or the privileged many or few got to work from home. And I'm just wondering, I haven't seen any stats on this, and I wish I'd have done my research before this, but my own personal view is that remote working has created higher levels of productivity, right? You've cut out the commute in many cases. People can structure their day in a much more efficient and effective way, and therefore they can be much more efficient and effective in terms of their job. So do you guys have a view on that? Of course, I don't have any data to bear that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I think, you know, if anybody's been back into the office, you suddenly realise how much more work you get done by working at home. There's no question about that. I think whether or not, you know, that's a good thing or not, I think we need to question that. I think, you know, Microsoft did a study, didn't they, kind of this year, where they were looking at kind of the amount of time people spent in back-to-back meetings and the amount of chats that they were doing out of hours and so on and so forth. And I think, you know, they definitely saw a pretty big decline in terms of the staff satisfaction if they were doing too many back-to-back meetings, and whether or not they weren't getting any kind of focus time or time when they weren't actually sat on a virtual call. So I think it's, you know, it's beholden on the management and the leadership to be able to manage that with their staff, to ensure that it doesn't become, I guess, too much of a burden. Actually, I think that's quite important. I think the other thing I was going to say, actually, kind of just in terms of that remote working bit, one of the other interesting things we've seen is where clients have historically perhaps been leading the pack in terms of flexible working, and, you know, they've allowed people to, you know, work from home kind of 1 or 2 days a week. All of a sudden have been overtaken by everybody else doing exactly the same thing. So this kind of this advantage that they had previously has been suddenly eroded, and they're suddenly finding themselves on the back foot. So that's been an interesting dynamic as well, actually, where you've suddenly had these market leaders suddenly going right to the back of the pack.
That's very interesting, David. And the other thing that just occurred to me there, I mean, if organizations are mandating people to come back into a physical office, if they're just going to be doing bloody Teams calls or Zoom calls, what's the point? What's the point? If half are in or a quarter are in, and everyone's interacting by Teams or virtual, what's the point?
Right? I think, you know, if you're going to sit around a table and do a meeting and collaborate with your peers, then great. I think you need to be careful if you kind of have some of your people in the office and some of them working remotely. I think that's quite a difficult dynamic to manage. But yeah, I mean, there's zero point in kind of trekking and doing a commute and sitting in front of your laptop all day, kind of doing Zoom meetings or whatever. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Thomas, what's your view on the productivity discussion point and the last point there?
Well, I know that certainly the Better.com CEO would disagree with you on productivity. I believe, you know, given his latest actions. But I think I think the productivity, the work productivity, if you look at a single day and your average employee, goes up because they, you know, they're just back to back in meetings. There's no bullshitting around in the coffee corner. There's no, you know, playing table tennis or whatever. No 1.5 hours lunch break because you go out with a couple of colleagues. It's just more productive. I also think we work more hours. You know, I see a lot of people starting a bit earlier because they don't have to commute. But, you know, it's the usual day starts at 8, let's say, and with the commute, and now they start at 8 at the computer, and usually they are back at 7 at home, and now they stay until 7 or 8 at the computer. So they do more hours. What I would like to factor into the productivity calculation is I think the remote culture also increased the lack of well-being, and that again led to higher attrition rates. So if you look at it from not on a day-by-day perspective, but on a company over the year, and you look at higher attrition rates and what you need then to recruit those people, to onboard the new people, I would doubt that the overall productivity is higher. I would say, you know, the healthy relationship with your coworkers, the trust with your coworkers can lead to better retention rates, better spirit, better well-being, and therefore yes, on a from a 1 day perspective, productivity might be lower, but overall, I'm not sure if this really improved productivity. But again, there's a difference between you, me, and David, and the younger generation. So if you look at companies like TopTal that have been founded remote, they have recruited remote. They have recruited people that wanted to work remote. For them, it's no change. So these people will not churn all of a sudden more likely because they work from home, because they've always, that's what they always wanted. But if you take people that have always had social interactions, that have always enjoyed being together with their colleagues, and you all of a sudden send them home and they miss this, then you break glass, I believe. So again, there's a difference between younger generation and unfortunately we count already to the older generation. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's the digital divide between the old geezers like us, and I hate to use that phrase, and the younger cohort. So Thomas and David, I really appreciate your time and your input and your analysis and insights. And I think, Thomas, that was an excellent call to arms to close on, guys. So I think we've got 2 minutes left. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if there is any questions, guys, we're here for 2 minutes if anyone wants to ask one. No questions, guys. That means I think we've done our job. Silence is acceptance. And as I said, thanks very much to our audience. Thanks for tuning in. David, Thomas, really appreciate it. Great to see you both and really enjoyed that. Take care, guys, and a very happy Christmas to you both and to you all. Thank you. Take care,
very much.
Thank you for having us. Gonna bye.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Goodbye.
bye.